What is infinity? Infinity is space. Space is the only thing which we have an intuitive and experiential relationship with that is absolutely the same throughout itself and that never ends. And so, by definition, it is infinite, and that is infinity. It is counterintuitive to think about it sometimes like this, that space is infinity, because we have the sense, sometimes, that the cosmos or the universe, however would want to define the universe, but if we take it in the loose sense as, let's say, the cosmos, that which has objects and structures, that the cosmos is infinite. But this is not necessarily the case at any moment given in time. Space, however, let's say, for the time being empty space, if we were to think about it as a single object or a single entity or a single characteristic, is the same throughout itself, and it is without end. And so even though we might want to argue that the cosmos is infinite, it isn't by definition infinite. The cosmos can be finite or can be thought as finite. But space itself, by definition, as something absolutely homogeneous, is infinite. And so what role does this play in our everyday life? Well, the role it plays, usually, it just hosts the objects which are usually the focus of our attention. We pay attention more to the objects in general than we do the space between the objects. The objects are the gravitational points, so to speak, or points of interest that are, for practical reasons, more important. We notice that objects actually have an effect when we interact with them, so that if we are hungry, we notice the objects that will satisfy that hunger, such as apples or just food in general. And also, the objects that we interact with have immediate consequences, so that when we climb a tree, we have a strong sense of reaction of gravity and of danger and of excitement, of strength, of adventure. And this is completely normal in the sense that as children, when we grow, we have a sense of playing with objects and having an interest in them because they come in such a large variety, whereas space itself, as an infinite homogeneous state, even though we can notice it, we tend to only notice it between objects. And so the objects, in a sense, in an experiential and intuitive sense, precede the space. So we notice objects first, and then we notice space. But when we think about it thoroughly and to its end, space might not necessarily precede the objects, but is inherent with the objects. And it could also be said that object itself, even though we might call it empty space, without necessarily understanding if that really is the case, we might actually treat empty space or just space as an object. And this changes everything when we treat space as the point of interest or the focus. And it changes everything for that duration of the time that we focus or put the point of highest interest, let's say, on space instead of the objects, because of the habits that are built in our relationship to objects. We build habits and we build self-interest in our relationship with objects, whether it is with food, housing, or any other survival mechanisms and mechanisms for pleasure, right? The pleasures that we get from objects are generally, though not always, associated with specific objects. Although in specific circumstances it would be easy to say that space would be an object of pleasure, such as, well, leaving the house or the home in order to experience a larger sense of space or experience of space, or climbing a mountain or a hill. People who are somewhat claustrophobic will probably relate to this more than not. And so, in the act of focusing on space more than objects in it, and seeing it as an infinite presence, considering it as a single object, what one notices, as with certain types of meditation, say in Buddhism, is that the relationship of the self with the objects start to untangle, start to unwind, start to loosen itself up, because the object of space is infinite, and therefore a reaction occurs with the already existing relationship that we have with objects in general, with particulars. So, in focusing and taking an interest in space and the infinite, we're in a process of untangling our relationship with objects in general. And it usually begins with the most intense dependence, if you want to call it, or relationship with objects. So if one has a high dependency, or let's say addiction to coffee, or any such type of relationship, focusing on the infinite will therefore have one of its first experiences as a thinking of coffee. But if the focus is maintained on space, then so too the untangling will maintain itself until it is on some level undone. And this undoing goes on different levels because our addictions, our dependencies are interconnected with other dependencies and connections. So, say an addiction to coffee was maybe stemmed from an overly desired sense of wanting to work. So the next thought, while staring or gazing into infinity, I thought about space. I thought about the relationship with work. Though at first it might not seem that there's a conscious relationship between coffee and work, because that connection maybe had been forgotten. But it is, because it is untangling itself in the face of infinity, you are experiencing that untangling as a retrospective undoing of the habitual self. And as it is even further maintained with the focus on space, as the attention is drawn back to objects, which is all a natural process, and there's there is no fault in this because it is a completely natural reaction in being a physical being in a physical world. But here we're doing a physical, or a rather spiritual activity onto itself, because the infinite is from where the spirit and the soul stem from. And so staring into the infinite space as a singular object, so to speak, as an absolutely homogeneous presence around us, as though we were in a dream, is to stare into one's own soul and one's own spirit, and the relationship, rather, also between the two. You realize that this characteristic of infinity is one and the same outside of your field of view as it is in front of you, and then there's like an acceptance of its quality that just, in a sense, instantaneously explodes, and there's a feeling of presence, and that presence is first you, your soul and your spirit, having found a balance, having rebalanced itself. Now, depending on to whether we're more in a forceful stare or in more of a surrendering gaze, the forceful stare will have more to do with your self being active. So that experience you have is more yourself being drawn into you, right? That quality of the self, that volitional effort and volitional energy will feel more palpable outside of you, and if there's anybody else near you, will probably feel that presence like a gravitational pull that they would be experiencing around you. If, however, there's a more surrender approach to the gaze of infinity, of space, then you experience more the presence of either the world, so the soul of the world or the spirit of the world, you would experience that more, or you will experience more the particulars of your soul. Whatever those might be.